So, Dr. Paul, thanks so much for joining me. Libertarians focus a lot on government. Out of all the institutions in society, I'm curious what makes government a unique institution worth all this intellectual energy?
Well, it's worth the energy if the energy is being used to devise a government that is strictly limited to the protection of liberty. If we're going to have government, it should be strictly limited. The founders made an attempt at that, but it didn't work out so well. There were too many loopholes. But all the energy I think you're referring to is going into government which is illicit. It's not a good government. It's not constitutional. It's not beneficial. And it has very little to do with liberty. Matter of fact, when you look at the welfare warfare state and the monetary system, it's devised mainly to undermine liberty. So all that activity is negative. So in many ways, freedom is something that is negative in the sense of what the government shouldn't be doing, rather than all these things they say, well, we have to have people freedom from any need and not be injured in any way, and they have to be taken care of. Well, that's not freedom. Freedom means the government allows us to be left to ourselves and to be responsible to ourselves.
Well, there's also corporations that have a lot of power. What is the difference between government doing something and something being done in the marketplace?
Well, sometimes there's no difference, and that's a problem. When the government does it, and if they get involved in a commercial event, and they're competitive with a private competition, this should be wrong morally, economically, and constitutionally. But then again, what we accept, or too many people accept in the marketplace, isn't purely in the market. Then there's this mixture that goes on. So when I hear socialists complaining about free markets and all this freedom being negative because look at what the corporations are doing, I think people have to sort it out. Are the corporations big and in control of things because they're in collusion with the government? And that is what I think happens. The government and even our social media, that's great, and they give us a lot of services, but they also had been developed, and they're the arm of government, and they provide so much of the private information of individuals to the government. That's no longer private. It's quasi-private, but it's an interventionist type of system, but it's also closer to a fascist system than it would be a free enterprise.
What is the non-aggression principle and self-defense principle?
Well, the non-aggression principle is something I talk about a whole lot, and it's very simple. Nobody's allowed to commit aggression. And Bastiat's in the law is really good on this because he makes a point that most people do understand. They take the position that you can't steal from people, you can't hurt people, and people recognize that, and they want to be protected against somebody coming and stealing and hurting them. But Bastiat's complaint and my complaint is that those rules should apply to the government. So if you don't want, if you want an honest government, you can't allow the government to tell us lies, but they tell us a lot of lies, and they commit a lot of aggression, fighting illegal wars. They commit a lot of fraud and theft by having a fraudulent monetary system. So if we as individuals aren't allowed to do it, the government shouldn't be allowed to do it. So the non-aggression is people can't commit aggression, and they can't have that aggression committed by a government for the benefit of special interests. If you can't steal from your neighbor, you're not allowed to send your congressman into your neighbor's house and take what you want from them and redistribute the wealth. And that is one principle that people very rarely pay attention to. And you asked also about the foreign policy the same way. We want to not use aggression against our friends and our neighbors, and the government shouldn't do that. But if our government goes and say, hey, it's a good idea for us to have control of the oil in Saudi Arabia or Iran or something like this, and we use aggression to do that, that is wrong. It should be a non-aggression, that we should never commit an act of war or sanctions or pressure to have our way. That doesn't mean that by ignoring it we endorse everything that they do, but if there's a fight in the Middle East and it's complex, especially even if it isn't complex, it's out of our jurisdiction, and it doesn't help. We don't have the authority to do it, and it usually backfires on us. So applying it to foreign policy, I think, is very important, because many people have heard me talk about blowback, because when you do something and you pick sides, which is what you have to do, the side that you're acting against aren't very happy. So if we go and start bombing people and putting on sanctions and penalizing people and support one faction over the other, they're going to be pretty unhappy with us, and that breeds, the terrorist attacks against us.
Let's say that I'm someone who only cares about the collective interests of poor Americans. Why should I care about libertarianism?
Well, you'd have to review history, and you could start, with the with our settlement at Plymouth Rock and Plymouth Colony, because for 3 years they tried socialism and it was a total disaster. People died and starved to death, and they didn't get along together. And then they finally turned over the land to the private owners, and the colony thrived and it survived. So the answer to the question is, the more freedom you have, the more prosperity you have. We were and had been in the past, not so much now, the freest country ever and the most productive and the largest middle class ever. But now that we've in the process of destroying our currency, this destroys the middle class, so the middle class is getting poorer, and there are more people hungry, even though we have apparently a lot of prosperity, but at the same time, we have a lot of people living in the streets. So if we want prosperity, then you have to have a freer market. And if you look at countries like Zimbabwe and Venezuela and the different South American countries, when they had freer economies, they were very prosperous. But right now, what we're seeing is we're becoming less free and less prosperous. And people would say, what do you mean? We're still the richest in the world. But it's all based on debt. Because we can print the world's currency, it's like printing gold. People take our money and they support and subsidize our prosperity, but that comes to an end, and what it does is sort of collapses. So the argument can't be that, the government has taken care of a lot of people, even though there's some problems. There's no doubt in my mind that the freer a country is, the more prosperous it will be, the larger the middle class will be, and the less violence will occur.
Many people say that we need the state to regulate companies that otherwise would act in their interests at the expense of others. Is the need for economic regulation a justification for government intervention?
No, and a lot of people believe that to be the case, the regulation. But where so many people from a libertarian view fall into the trap is no regulation, no regulation. That's not my position. I don't want government regulation. I want market regulation, so that if there's a housing bubble due to the government, you don't bail out the big companies. And they say, well, what we need are more regulation. So they come in, and then being in Washington, I know if you want more protection of the consumer in the banking industry, the bankers come in and write the regulation. So they always backfire. If you want regulation on drugs, you have the drug industry regulate. And of course, they push the prices up, and the same way with medical insurance. The more regulations and distribution of wealth you get, the worse the conditions get. But I try to avoid talking about no regulations. I don't want arbitrary special interest regulation, and that is what it is. As soon as the government gets power, the special interests will gravitate to Washington and control the regulation. What we want to do is not that we have to deny them power. Some people say, well, yeah, that we should have independent people writing these regulations and all this. That doesn't work. As long as the government has power, there's somebody going to try to take advantage of it, and that is the reason why I come to the conclusion you have to eliminate this authority to do this, and they have no incentive. And the best example I can get is I was never bothered. I was in Washington for 23 years. I was never bothered with a lobbyist, and I never was bothered. And technically and morally, I would say that if there's a group of companies and they had PACs and they wanted to donate to my campaign, under no conditions, I would take the money if it were legal. But no, they they just didn't bother with me because they wanted to make a deal with me. And so it's the power that you have to get rid of, not more regulation. So I don't endorse this whole idea that we have to get money out of politics. We want to get government out of politics, out of how to run our lives.
Are there any votes you made in Congress that you regret?
Not really. There's a couple, I guess, people could go through. Sometimes you get a bill that might be, most of the bills are a mixture. It isn't always clean cut. But when they were clean cut, it was very easy. Sometimes you have to weigh it. What if you have a bill that says that you're going to lower the taxes on so-and-so, but you're going to raise the taxes on somebody else? Well, is there an answer to that? And I just use a calculator. If you were saving more money than you were spending, I'd vote for it. But if it was even Steven, I would look and see which one does the most harm to the economy. There may be something like that. I've never looked at every single vote to find out which one it would be, but no, basically, most people kidded me, and they said, "Boy, you probably sleep well at night," and I'd like to think that. So,
yeah. It's interesting. During this impeachment inquiry, I remember you actually gave alternative reasoning for voting for Bill Clinton's impeachment. Why did you vote to impeach Bill Clinton?
Yeah, well, in some ways, maybe somebody who wanted to be really nitpicking with me might have argued. And I guess I thought about that. Maybe I shouldn't have even done that. But my argument is I don't know of any president I wouldn't have voted to impeach, because I'd probably vote to impeach most congressmen I knew too, because of their lack of respect for the Constitution. Ronald Reagan, I knew him the best, and he was a good person, and yet he did some things that I just really didn't like. The Congress had passed a bill, a Boland Amendment, to prohibit the president from spending any money in Nicaragua, and they did it secretly. And I thought, well, it's not that he shouldn't have done it anyway without even a prohibition. The Constitution doesn't allow him to just go start his own war. But for the Congress to speak out, it's the reverse of declaring war and said, don't go to war, and yet they still did get involved. So that's just an example of they're all guilty to some degree, and I like to think more, and that's an impractical thing that I'm saying, but we should be impeaching these ideas, to make a point. Well, if you want to live in a free and prosperous society, you have to get rid of the bad ideas and get people to replace them with better ideas, and that's why I spent a lot of time on education, teaching Austrian economics, and working for sound money, because I'm so convinced that as long as you have a money machine, and it's always a monopoly of the government, that is what facilitates, that's what pays the bills. So the liberals and the conservatives agree that deficits don't matter. And just look now, we're running over $1 trillion a year and going higher. The Republicans usually have greater deficits than the Democrats. So it's all a farce, but it's also something that doesn't last forever. Confidence is finally destroyed, and foreign policy collapses because we can't afford it. And that's when people like you and others should really be speaking loudly and clearly about what can replace it, and it's not complex, it's just the concept of liberty.
Terrific. Final question for you. You're talking to someone who's never heard of libertarianism. What is your elevator pitch?
I say, would you like to be in charge of your own life? And that would be it. Do you think the government should tell you about how to run your personal life? What you eat, drink, smoke, religion, or anything else? Do you think the government should do this? And most people say, no, it's my life. I can deal with that. Well, do you think the government should start wars, without a declaration of war? And should we only fight wars for national defense? And most people would say, yeah, there's no sense in us going out there and spending money on wars for the special interests. And also on economic policy, it's instead of talking in a too much academically, say, well, in economics, why don't you have the right to spend your money? You have a right to your life. Why shouldn't you have the right to keep your money? If you have a right to keep your money, but we concede it with the income tax. They own your life because you have to give everything to the government, and the government gives you back so much under the conditions on how you're going to spend it. So it's just a matter of personal liberty that should bring people together. It'd be more prosperity and a lot more peace.
Thank you to everyone listening, and thank you, Dr. Paul, for promoting separation of economy and state for the same reason we need separation of church and state. Take care.
Well, wonderful. Nice to be with you.
Bye. Thank you.